Harris to kick off a tour focusing on reproductive rights in swing states, the campaign tour to begin in Florida. Tim Walz is unhurt after his motorcade is involved in a crash. The cause of the collision remains unclear, one injured in the crash. Democrats ask Trump if he accepted $10 million from Egypt. Democrats raise questions on foreign funds in 2016 polls. Hispanic voters favor Harris on health and climate. Hispanic voters give Harris an edge in the latest Ipsos poll. Plus, the immigration fight, Trump versus Harris, who could be better for skilled worker visas, and will Trump deliver on his promise on green cards for foreign students? Just 62 days until the US election, and it's the end of the Labor Day weekend, which observers say marks a phase when more voters begin to really start paying attention to what's happening on the election trail. This as we enter the final critical leg of that race. Now, Harris plans to campaign this week in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania. Later in the week, Trump heads to Wisconsin. Both candidates have doubled down in battleground states. On Monday, Harris was at a joint event with Joe Biden, capitalizing on the president's image as Union Joe. They are targeting unionized blue-collar workers who make up a large portion of key voters in certain swing states.
It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think it's more important than any title.
Weeks after announcing his historic decision to step away from the presidential race, Joe Biden has now fully embraced the role of a Kamala Harris campaigner. The duo tried to woo working-class voters at an event at a local union hall in Pittsburgh on Monday. Biden said that there is only one choice as far as the U.S. presidential race is concerned: Kamala Harris.
The first decision I made to nominate his nominee in 2020 was selecting her as my vice president. And by the way, it was the single best decision I made as president of the United States of America.
Reports say that it is Biden's carefully crafted return to the campaign trail as he shifts from candidate to surrogate mode. According to reports, Biden's advisors in the last few weeks have been going over what his plans on the campaign trail will entail. Biden will visit Pennsylvania, Wisconsin and Michigan over the next 5 days. All three are blue wall states where he beat former President Donald Trump in 2020 by a thin margin. Reports suggest that Biden will be promoting the Democratic Party's popular agenda items during these visits. The president is expected to spend a substantial amount of time in Pennsylvania, the state where he was born. Reports say that his allies are hoping that his political influence in the state can help Harris. During his visit to the state, the 81-year-old did not waste any time in vouching for Harris.
I promise you, if you elect Kamala Harris as president, it'll be the best decision you will have ever made.
Interestingly, ever since ending his campaign, Biden has seen a small uptick in his approval ratings. Whether this influences Harris's approval ratings remains to be seen. Historically, a vice president running for the Oval Office has almost always benefited when the incumbent president has a good approval rating. With Vishal Vivek, Bureau Report, NDTV World.
Kamala Harris used that joint campaign appearance in Pittsburgh with President Joe Biden to say that U.S. steel should remain domestically owned. This is a major policy position for the vice president, which coincides with the White House's earlier position to the company's planned sale to Nippon Steel of Japan. Harris says U.S. steel should remain American-owned and American-operated. This view is similar to Biden's view, who opposed the sale.
The first decision I made, the nominee in 2020, was selecting her as my vice president. And by the way, it was the single best decision I made as president of the United States of America. I promise you, if you elect Kamala Harris as president, it'll be the best decision you will have ever made.
We will continue to strengthen America's manufacturing sector. And on that point, the president mentioned it. U.S. Steel is an historic American company. And it is vital for our nation to maintain strong American steel companies. And I couldn't agree more with President Biden. U.S. Steel should remain American-owned and American-operated. And I will always have the back of America's steelworkers. America's workers.
The Trump campaign will keep up its momentum in key swing states in the coming days. This as the former president defends himself in the aftermath of an incident at Arlington Cemetery in Virginia last week, while Harris drummed up support amongst blue-collar voters on Labor Day. Trump kept a relatively low profile in the run-up to next week's debate. Meanwhile, the Republican candidate continues to fight off backlash surrounding the Arlington Cemetery controversy, where he paid a visit to the gravesite of military personnel who died in Afghanistan. Trump has maintained that his staffers were blameless, pointing instead to Biden's many failings during the U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan. A cemetery worker was reportedly shoved by a Trump employee at the gravesite. And Trump is also under fire for taking pictures in a part of the cemetery where political campaigning is banned under federal law. Immigration-related issues remain amongst the biggest concerns for voters heading into the 2024 election. It also has a wider impact on people in other parts of the world, including India. Take, for example, your friends or perhaps relatives working temporarily in the US on visas like the H-1B. This affects Indian IT giants like TCS or Wipro too, who bring talent into the US on those visas. So, Trump versus Harris. Who will be better, and what will it mean for the H-1B and other visas that bring in skilled workers into the US? Let's take a closer look at this topic. We're joined by Ron Hira. He's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University. Ron has testified numerous times before the US Congress about high-skilled immigration. We're also joined by Karthik Ramakrishnan, political scientist and founder at AAPI Data. That's a research organization that focuses on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Ron, let me start with you. First, just remind us briefly what it was like during Trump's first term as president as far as skilled workers are concerned, and what do you expect this time around if he is in the White House?
Sure, Allister. Thanks for having me on. So in running up into the first Trump administration, during his campaign in 2016, actually the H-1B visa program became a topic of the campaign, both on the Republican primary as well as during the general election against Clinton. And Trump, when he got elected, one of the first things he did was said he's going to reform the program significantly. Now, throughout that term, he really didn't do a whole lot administratively. They weren't able to get anything through Congress. Denial rates did go up. There was certainly a lot of public attention around the program, but really in terms of lasting impact, it didn't have a significant lasting impact in that first term. And then with the Biden administration, there really hasn't been any action except for maybe some loosening up of the rules.
Rajati, Karthik, what would you say? Would you agree with that? That there was no sort of impact, but was there a certain amount of fear created during Trump's reign in office the first time around?
Thank you for having me. I mean, I'll say that, when it comes to immigration policy, on the one hand, if you're looking at laws that are being passed, Congress is gridlocked. You need to overcome the Senate filibuster. So it's really hard to get legislation passed, especially on an issue like immigration, where it's a complex issue and the parties are divided in many ways, mostly between each other, but sometimes within the party as well. The thing about immigration is that the Trump administration did slow down its visa processing, not just on H-1Bs, but also a green card as well as citizenship applications. So there were the wait time skyrocketed even before COVID. And then with COVID, of course, things slowed down even more. The Trump administration in general, looking ahead, wants to have a much tighter control on immigration. So even though the Trump campaign and Trump himself has tried to distance himself from Project 2050, generally speaking, with senators like Tom Cotton wanting to cut down on family visas, and you still have a lot of Indian Americans coming in on family visas, that would be under threat. And chances are that there'll be a much greater tightening of the H-1B visa program administratively if there is a second Trump administration. Finally, I'll say is that
Karthik, what would we expect from Harris as far as these visas go? Status quo?
I would say so, but one thing I'll say that even the status quo now, the H-1B visa program it still faces significant challenges in terms of qualified, highly skilled workers being able to work in the U.S. So you're seeing a big increase in undocumented, right, Indian immigration to the U.S. trying to use the asylum process, which they've closed down now, to try to get jobs. So generally speaking, I think in either administration, it's going to be challenging, but probably even more so in the Trump administration than the Harris administration.
Karthik, we're going to come back to undocumented immigrants in just a bit, but before that, I just want a quick reaction from Ron here. Ron, Trump has talked about providing green cards to foreign students studying at U.S. colleges and university. Great idea for the likes of Indian students here. A great way also perhaps for the U.S. to retain global talent. But if Trump's track record on skilled workers, you said that he didn't really move the needle much, but he did try to. If we take that into account, would he really deliver on this promise? Is it as simple as that to dole out green cards to foreign students once they're done?
No. In fact, the president, so we have a divided government here. There's a separation of powers, and that would be going beyond what the executive branch can do. So there are things that an administration can do. Granting green cards to, graduates of U.S. universities, STEM graduates would not be something that the president has the authority to do. So there's no way that Trump could fulfill that promise. And by the way, his spokespeople, walked back those statements that he made during that one. I guess it was kind of a webinar that he did with some venture capitalists out in Silicon Valley. So unlikely that they're going to get that done. There are things that one can do administratively, and the Trump administration did try to tighten some of the rules at the end of his administration in 2020, but it was too late. The clock kind of ran out. There has been a consensus that's been developing around trying to grant the H-1Bs, not just through a random lottery system, but via the highest wages or highest skills. This is something that, in fact, the Biden campaign had run on in 2020. It was on their campaign website. So that may be something in play. Whether you need to have Congress do it or whether an executive order or action by one of the agencies is sufficient remains to be seen.
Okay, Karthik, reaction on this one now. The Associated Press had reported on how Trump filed an application, this was way back in June 2022, for an H-1B visa for a worker to be hired at the company that owns Truth Social, of course, Trump's social media company. Now, the company says that it's terminated the services of that employee since, but Trump's son-in-law filed an H-1B application to hire someone at an investment firm that he started. So how do we really view this? So double standards to some extent here?
This reveals the complexity of immigration, right? I mean, we have a broken immigration system in America, unlike other countries like Canada that have a much more rational process that is not politicized, that allows for temporary worker programs to fill needs where they exist. When it comes to high skilled workers, when it comes to agricultural workers, the system has been broken for decades now. And it is a double standard that almost everyone now accepts as part of the game. Business must go on. People need to get going in terms of what businesses that they're running. And so, yeah, and I'll also say when it comes to Trump on this issue of green cards for high skilled workers, for college graduates who are foreign students, he's mentioned this in the past. He mentioned it in 2015 and 2016, and then walked those back. The reality is the Republican Party is largely a nativist party now in the US. There used to be moderates on immigration over a decade or two ago, but most of them have been eliminated through the electoral process. So it's going to be really hard to do anything that is immigrant friendly within the Republican Party
Right.
because there is intense opposition within the party for that.
Okay, Ron, Karthik, stay with us. We're going to look at the illegal border crossing issue, but first let's put it in a little bit of context for our viewers. Now, this is, of course, a hot button issue here in the elections. Indians have now become the third largest group of undocumented or undocumented migrants living in the United States. That's according to a report from Pew Research Center as of 2021. We're talking about 700,000 unauthorized Indians living in the United States. Many are making their way into the US via dangerous routes. Reports say some freeze to death, drown, or are kidnapped by their very handlers who bring them across the border. So after paying their smugglers, they're held hostage until their families in India pay an even larger ransom to get them into the United States. Now, before we get into politics of it all, Karthik, in 2022, a couple and their 2 children froze to death just a few meters from the US-Canada border. Another family drowned in a river trying to enter the United States. So Canada is one route, but what about the deadly Darien Gap?
Absolutely. Now you have, I mean, until very recently, when you saw the Biden administration close off, the asylum seeking opportunities, a lot of Indian immigrants used the southern border route and to try to have asylum claims as their way of getting temporary work authorization in the U.S. It's a symptom of how fundamentally broken our immigration system is. It's also important for Indian Americans and Indians to realize that when they talk about illegal immigration or undocumented immigration, that includes Indian American populations as well. It's not just about Mexicans or Central Americans. And that's important because Indian Americans now, largest Asian group that are undocumented, if we're talking about mass deportations, which Trump and others in Trump's orbit, like Stephen Miller and others, have advocated, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of Indians being rounded up and kicked out of the country. And they've talked about these massive holding pens as places to keep them and to rapidly process those immigrants. So that's something very significant.
Let me ask Ron about that mass deportation. Trump's talked about them. Do you think that will actually come through? Would we actually see something like that?
Yeah,
Well,
it's
he talked
very hard
about
to
the
predict
wall last
where
time.
they're
Sorry,
going, what
and
they're
I
going to
think
end up doing.
he means what he says. So if he's
Sorry, Karthik, that's for Ron.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I think it's really hard to tell what's going to happen there. The certainly their rhetoric has been hard line. Now, whether they can really execute that, will things get tied up in our court system? So unlike Canada, which Karthik talked about, which was, here's a rational system. That's a parliamentary system where the government that's in charge is also in charge of the legislative branch. Here we have divided government. We have separations of power. So it's not as though that the president is a king and can do whatever he or she wants to do. So there'll be limitations on what they can execute, and then of course there'll be concerns about the publicity and the backlash that comes from mass deportation. So clearly the immigration system is broken. We haven't had major immigration legislation since 1986. So you imagine that that's almost 40 years now that we haven't had significant changes to our immigration system.
Okay. Ron Gothic, now Indians reportedly pay around 50,000 USD to 100,000 USD to make their way illegally into the US. That's anywhere between 4 lakh rupees to 8 lakh rupees. This is not cheap. So clearly, these are not Indians who are poor, fleeing poverty, but middle-class families hoping to make it big, the American dream here in the US. This is exactly the kind of economic illegal migrants that immigrants that the US does not want to see. Very quickly, a quick reaction. We don't have much time. Ron, to you, what do you think of this kind of demographic making their way into the US from India?
Well, it's part of the problem that we have in the U.S., which is we have a system where you can get work, undocumented work. You don't have to have work authorization. We're just not enforcing those kinds of laws. Does the Trump administration start to enforce it and take away that magnet, right? So usually when we talk about immigration, there's push factors where people are fleeing poverty, like you're saying, and then there's pull factors in the U.S. where, is the U.S. a magnet for this kind of illegal behavior? And obviously, because the U.S. government hasn't been enforcing things, it continues to be a magnet for that kind of activity and that behavior. And I'd say it's a problem not just for
Right.
the U.S. It's a problem for those workers because they're going to be working under without the rules and regulations and without protections. So it's bad for all workers when we have this kind of system.
Right. Karthik, I was hoping to get a reaction from you, but we are running out of time. We'll definitely speak to you again in the next few weeks as we head to the US elections. Ron Hira at Howard University and Karthik Ramakrishnan with AAPI Data. Thank you so much for your time this morning. In other news now, multiple cars traveling in the motorcade carrying Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the Democratic candidate for vice president, crashed in Milwaukee. Mr. Walz was not hurt. The cars involved were at the rear of the motorcade and were carrying members of the press who traveled with Walz. Reporters said that they were violently thrown forward after being hit from behind, sending their vehicle into a car in front of them. At least one person was injured, and Walz later spoke at a rally in Milwaukee. Let's listen in.
First off, let me say, some of you might have heard, some of my staff and members of the press that were traveling with us were involved in a traffic accident on the way here today. We've spoken with the staff. I'm relieved to say that with a few minor injuries, everybody's going to be okay. So, thank you. President Biden and Vice President Harris called to check in, and we certainly appreciate their concern. And I want to express my sincere thanks to the U.S. Secret Service and all the local first responders for their quick reaction to help.
Now, no matter who wins the White House, the next president of the United States has to deal with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Now, as the war in Ukraine continues, a Kremlin spokesperson says there is one person who they know might be less of a surprise. Who is that? Take a look.
With just a little more than 2 months to go before it goes to the polls, the US is at the center of attention for world leaders, owing to the influence it holds on the international stage. One among the leaders is Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to a report, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has said that Russia sees the Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris as a more predictable opponent than Republican candidate Donald Trump, adding that there is no prospect of an improvement in relations with Washington. Peskov dismissed Trump's repeated claims that he could end the Ukraine war within 24 hours if he were to be voted to power again. But this is not the first time Russia has hinted at supporting a Democrat. Back in February, Putin had surprisingly said that he would prefer a Joe Biden presidency over Donald Trump, branding him as experienced and predictable. Interestingly, Biden has been a fierce critic of Putin for years. He had called Putin a killer before the invasion of Ukraine. Peskov said that Biden's predictability applies to almost all Democrats, including Harris. Putin has often commented on the US election. In June, he had said that Russia did not care about the next US president and that the US court system was being used in a political battle against Trump. On the other hand, Trump has publicly praised Putin many times, even labeling him as a genius when Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022. Kremlin's comments don't seem to divulge much about its preferred leader in the White House. US-Russia ties will probably remain frosty. With Vishal Vivek, Bureau Report, NDTV.
That's all we have time for here on US Election Watch. I'm Allister D'Souza in Washington, D.C.
Great tasting coffee shouldn't cost a fortune. That's why McCafe coffees are made with 100% Arabica beans and fresh organic milk and start from only $1.39.
Whoever you are and whatever might happen, Remitly money transfers keep life moving. Because it's more than a transaction. It's a connection, a hug, or a hello, what's happening here? Send money to South Asia with Remitly. Send money that moves them. Download the Remitly app.
You ever thought about yours?
Funeral? Yeah.
Flowers, service.
Everyone there. The more the merrier.
Even your ex, Mark?
It sounds a bit mad, but I think I want to be buried with these.
Scatter you where?
I think here.
It's your day. You have what you want.
What about you with your ex, Sue? Which one?
For help starting your conversation, visit Co-op Funeral Care.
By the time I was 9, I stopped dreaming of ever starting school.